Welcome everybody to the second day of this webinar series on the legitimacy of the European constitutional orders. Today we go straight into the core of the workshop, that is into the task of questioning, challenging, refashioning the conceptual tools with which to make sense of what a dear colleague and co-author of mine, Jan-Erik Fossum, which I don't know if he's in the audience today, he was here yesterday, characterizes as the European constitutional field. We will consider specific constitutional trajectories, starting today with those of Italy and Portugal, and moving in the coming days to those of Britain, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Hungary, and Spain. All the time, we will keep an eye on how such trajectories have been influenced by a past that willingly or unwillingly has been common, many times tragically so, and by intense cultural, social, political, and economic relationships. Suffice to point here to the deep positive and negative influence, the positive and negative lessons, so to say, exerted by the Weimar Constitution on all post-war European constitutions, or, if you wish a more specific example, to the reciprocal influence between the Italian and the Spanish Constitution. Article 1 of the 1931 Spanish Constitution exerted quite an influence over Article 1 of the Italian Constitution. La República de los Trabajadores de todas las clases gets translated into the Repubblica Fondata sul Lavoro, then resulting in the 1947-48, depending how you refer to that, Italian Constitution exporting its fundamental Article 3.2 into a Spanish Article 9.2, a crucial article, obviously, and I would say exporting a good deal of the quotation marks economic constitution into the Spanish Constitution. At the same time, we will consider how constitutional trajectories have shifted and perhaps require considering the ways in which different paths combine over time, blurring the clarity of the threefold distinction between the three trajectories. May I add that the aim of the workshop is, in comparison with that of world constitutionalism or global administrative law, rather modest, to the extent that we remain within the European borders, and to the extent that the deeply ambivalent project of European integration, as we had the occasion to discuss yesterday, and we will have again on Friday, if I remember correctly, gives us a very good excuse to consider the ways in which national constitutional trajectories meet, or more than meet. Before I give the floor to Marco Goldoni, that is the first speaker today, I want to add that we plan this session as one with 3 papers. We wanted also to deal with France, with a fascinating story of the resistant 1946 constitution, the 2 referenda that preceded it, and the convoluted developments leading to the 1958 constitution, and why not with de Gaulle himself. That proved not to be possible because Denis Varengé, for personal reasons, that we are deeply sad about, cannot be with us today. But we hope to have the chance, quite obviously, of discussing the issue with him in the coming future. So without any further ado, I give the floor to Marco Goldoni, who will speak to us about the Italian Constitution and, of course, the central actor, political parties.
Thanks a lot, Agustin. So very quickly, what I plan to do is to discuss a particular phase of Italian constitution making, and in particular the Italian Republican style of constitution making from the end of Second World War. But in order to do this, I will first make a couple of methodological points, fundamentally inspired and in dialogue with Ackermann's work, not only revolutionary constitutions, but also previous constitutional and comparative constitutional law works. And then I will need to take a quick step back in order to frame the reconstruction of the Italian style of constitution making within the wider question of, I would say, state building and the construction of political unity, which will allow me to say a few things about what is absolutely, I would say, original about the Italian experience, and at the same time, what is absolutely common about the Italian experience. And I want to end with a problematization of what we're going to make, not only in terms of European integration, but in terms of, I would say, general constitutional theory of today, of the idea of constitution making, and in particular of an idea of constitution making where political parties, mass political parties, play a fundamental role. Now, first things first, as I said at the beginning, I'm going to share amateurish PowerPoint. I'm not a great master of PowerPoint, so forgive me for the style. Questions of method. I mean, in revolutionary constitutions, the framework is dictated fundamentally by the temporal process of constitution making, basically four steps. I want to add on top of that an idea that was actually quite central in Ackermann's previous project, in particular With the People, but which is an idea that probably in American political science is quite common, no? The idea of a political regime. Quite interestingly, actually, the idea of a political regime is actually, or used to be, I would say, quite common also in Italian constitutional studies, but we will see why and under which circumstances. I find the idea of a political regime particularly helpful in order to capture the identity of a constitutional order. Because this is the moment where, it's the moment of coupling, between the political system and certain subsocial systems. And we'll see how it happened in the Italian case. Now, regime is defined by Ackermann as the matrix of institutional relationships and fundamental values that are usually taken as the constitutional baseline in normal political life. There is a sense in which the regime makes ordinary political life intelligible. I would say probably it also tracks what are the available options in terms of future trajectories for political actors within the realm of ordinary legality. That is, without the necessity of engaging with unconventional adaptation of the political regime and therefore the legal order. I think it is clearly included in the definition, but given that this is my theme, I want to stress it clearly. When Ackermann mentioned institutional relationships, he is clearly also thinking about the party system. And clearly in the US case, the two-party system is one of the fundamental defining features of the constitutional order. And I also want to say that the regime cannot be understood, and we will see why, as a paradigm. That is something that necessarily excludes anything that is not intelligible through the paradigm, but it is more something that unfolds. So it's a set of relationships that unfolds, and they stay usually in tension with the previous regime. But there is always the possibility that a successive regime can somehow shed a different light on certain principles or values that animated the previous regime. So, and this is clearly will introduce the theme that revolutionary changes, when it comes to the revolutionary pathways of changing and of constitutional transformation, are not, let me use a mouthful, totalitarian. But they invest obviously fundamental aspects. And there is also another important point, and we will see why this plays out actually in the Italian tradition. There is, in the way we can read in between the lines of We the People and Revolutionary Constitutions, the emphasis on the origin of the regime, an Arendtian point, which in my view sticks there throughout Ackermann's constitutional work. And the idea is that the origin carries within its own principle. And this will have an echo throughout the life of a particular regime. This is something that actually is not so unfamiliar also to a certain type of Italian constitutional doctrine. And I also want to stress that this is obviously a way for Ackermann to draw a distinction between what he would probably consider a purely political conception of constituent power, according to an old classic positivist approach to constituent power, basically brute facts that we need to postulate in order to assume that there is an origin for the legal order, but this origin remains outside of the legal order. Now look at this important point, in my view, that actually pays out in constitutional analysis. The origin of the regime is internal to the regime itself. So it doesn't remain outside of the regime. And this is, in my view, an important Arendtian point that basically infuses Ackermann's work. And in my view, is probably one of the most insightful. Now, I want to use this type of framework in order to try to understand the Italian style of constitution making, and in particular the Republican type of constitution making, on the basis of basically two hypotheses. The first one is necessary, and it is a background hypothesis. I have to introduce it in order to ward off what I would see as really, I would say, predictable objections. Regime formation is not exactly the same thing as formation of political unity. The operations that shape a political regime might actually overlap or coincide sometimes with processes of state formation, but they are not exactly the same, which with a more, I would say, common terminology in constitutional studies is the equivalent of saying that you can analytically draw a distinction between sovereignty and government, but probably, most likely, and this would be my hypothesis, there is no solution of continuity. So it's not that there is a strict separation between the governing operations and the formation of political unity. And this is important in the Italian case, because as we will see, there is something quite interesting about the Republican style of constitution making, but it is inscribed in a history of construction of political unity that dates back to, say, conventionally 1861, where political unity is actually achieved clearly not through revolutionary pathways. And this is actually helped me to thematize what I'm going to say in the last part of my intervention in terms of where are we today when it comes to constitution making. Very quickly, a couple of points just for the people who are not familiar with Italian constitutional history. I just want to pinpoint a couple of things. Italian unity, political unity, is achieved basically by conquest, by one of the northern kingdoms, Kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia, who was already organized constitutionally through a flexible basic law called Statuto Albertino, a classic 1848 octroyé constitution. I would say loosely tailored around the British experience, with some concessions in terms of civil and political rights. Now, the interesting point is that here the framing of political unity and actually, I would say, the emergence of the first political regime of the Kingdom of Italy is actually happened actually around not a revolutionary process, but what I would actually define as an elitist construction. I mean, it's certain it's obviously the king and certain members of the political elite that plan and actually put and implement the realization of political unity. Long story short, for quite a long period, we could describe this type of political regime as a constitutional monarchy with a flexible constitution, a political system characterized by alliances between local elites, and a constitutional doctrine that emerged in order to formalize this construction and which becomes dominant at the end of the 19th century, which is whose main representative authors is Vittorio Emanuele Orlando, and whose main tenets of this constitutional doctrine are the idea of government by administration, apolitical conception of the constitutional order, deep distrust of political parties. So far, I would say, so good, in the sense that there's nothing problematic probably under this reconstruction. Now, a first element of originality, probably what I will claim is probably, and unfortunately, the most original contribution of Italian constitutional development to the European constitutional discourse, comes with the end of World War I, a complication, I would say, and a rise of complexity in social organization, which is detected actually by Italian scholars, Santi Romani in primis, and of course World War I, the extension of male suffrage first, second Russian Revolution, the echoes that this has over the development of the Socialist Party and of trade unionism. At first, I would say, aborted discussion of the necessity of a general reform of state organization through a constituent assembly, which fails, partially, but only partially, because of the distrust, as it happens in Russia, among certain sections of the Socialist Party, and most importantly, a couple of years of heightened social conflict, which goes under the name of the Red Biennium, or the Red 2 years, which, in my view, together with the fact that there has not been an attempted constitutional solution to the mounting social crisis, opens the way to a different institutional solution. I mean, in Polanyi's term, we could say that what we see here is a perverted counter movement. It's an attempt to address the incipient crisis, but unfortunately, it doesn't come from a socialist reorganization. And in the Italian case, the constitutional question takes the form of the fascist solution. That is, a non-democratic, actually authoritarian movement and then party that is capable to basically exploit the weaknesses of the previous constitutional system, and it obtains in this way a change of the political regime. Now, I won't go into the details of this because I want to spend more time on the Republican experience, but this is quite important in order to thematize at the end the issue of constitution making and constitution change. I mean, the rise of the fascist movement did not put into question the construction of political unity. So the form of state unity and even its monarchical expression are not really at the center of the concerns of the fascist movement. Quite interestingly, the fascist movement, as I read it, tries to solve what I would say is the disorder generated by the entrance or the entry into the political stage of the masses. So it is an answer to the question of the reorganization of the constitutional political order vis-a-vis the new subjectivity, basically, of political masses. And I think it is undeniable that the Fascist Party introduced fundamental reforms into both the political system and social organization that really cuts across many spheres of society, without, again, and this is seemed to be until this point a recurrent theme, without again resorting to a systematization of those reforms. So the Fascist Party, although some of the fascist constitutional lawyers, those who were actually socialized within fascism, were claiming and were actually stating forcefully the necessity of a rationalization of what they call the fascist constitution. This actually was never on the top of the priorities of the fascist regimes, whose main traits were clearly the concentration of constituent power, and here constituent power means basically capacity of generating and entrenching political and social reforms in the executive, and in particular in the hands of the President of the Council, an electoral system with only one list, at the center of which would be the Fascist Party, and a corporative organization of labor capital relations. So quite pervasive. I mean, in the debate between those who actually saw fascism as a somehow a natural development from the previous regime, and those who actually saw in fascism a cut and actually a repudiation of central parts of the previous regime, I definitely side with the latter. I mean, the fascist regime is a different political regime. I mean, which again, as I said at the beginning, this doesn't mean that it is, and again, this is quite a controversial point, we won't have the time to go into this, but it's not a totalitarian regime under the aspect that it wants to change everything. It accommodates certain aspects of the previous legal order, but it is capable of imposing and implementing, I would say, transformative reforms. Now, one quick point before we move to the Republican experience, which is the one that I'm most interested in, and I think it's the one we should most reflect upon. It is already the case that during the interwar period, not only Italy, but other countries, and in other countries, because of the entrance of the masses into the political stage, mass political parties have become probably the main bearers of the respective constitutional orders. And this is quite an important phenomenon. I want to pause a second and try to problematize it. The question that the central role of the political parties rise for theory of constitution making is whether we can meaningfully talk about constitution making in a democratic sense without mass political parties. And I will try at the end not to somehow take stock of this problematization. Now, in the case of Italy, and this is why I said there was an element of originality in the Italian solution, the centrality of the political party actually took the form of a monoparty system. And that was quite unique for, I would say, the majority of Western countries in the interwar period. And to a certain extent, it actually, given I've mentioned it before, probably disqualified what Polanyi says about the impact of the gold standard on the fascist transformation of European countries. Polanyi says, look, the UK and the US are very quick at a certain point at the beginning of the 30s to get out of the gold standard. This doesn't happen with certain other countries, namely, for example, Germany and Italy. That's why they plunge into these fascist reforms. I mean, the clear trajectory of the fascist regime is that the core tenets of the fascist regimes are already there by 1928. That is 1 year even before the Wall Street crash. And this is something, in my view, makes that experience quite unique in the European context. At one level, surprisingly so, less unique is what comes after. which probably belongs more, I would say, to a certain European ethos that takes shapes at the end of World War II. And yeah, it's quite useful, the temporalization offered by revolutionary constitutions, because at time one, we have a number of insurgents that emerge and are immediately organized through traditional political parties. Here, by traditional political parties, I mean, as I make reference here, those who somehow could connect with the self-imposed exile from the Chamber of Deputies that happened in 1924 when Mussolini commissioned a sicario in order to kill the leader of the Socialist Party, Matteotti. And from now on, we can clearly see that the restoration of traditional political parties will basically play the function of being the engine of constitution making. And this happens under in a number of ways. First of all, when the fascist regime falls, 25th of July 1943, a Committee of National Liberation is created and is made basically and is organized around the 6 main political parties. 4 of them will be absolutely key then in the writing of the Constitution. But there are other important moves that around 1944 and 1945 basically make possible for the bearers, no, what will come the future constitutional order to install themselves, no, as the main actors, as main political actors. Key is Togliatti's turn in Salerno and the support that he gives to a government of national unity. And this is a formula, again, that which will become really recurrent in Italian history up to today, fundamentally, for different reasons, with different parties, obviously, and with different formulas, but always, no, in moments of crisis, you always see this aggregation, no, around themes of either national unity or national security of the main political parties. And then, of course, we have a series of acts. I think the most important one is the document that delegate executive powers to the Committee of National Liberation in the occupied part of the country between 44 and 45. So to make it clear, this means that in the north of Italy, although probably not very effectively, but there was a clear mandate to the parties themselves to organize locally executive power. At that point in time, I have to remind that the north of Italy was basically first occupied by German troops and later was basically declared to be a social republic, which was basically a reformulation of the fascist regime. Now, in order to show what is probably slightly peculiar, although not exceptional, about the Italian case, I want to stress the different dynamic very quickly between Italy and France, which for other aspects are actually quite similar. Now, very quickly, in both countries, the constituent question, that is the question of setting up a constituent assembly in order to generate a new constitutional order which repudiates authoritarian experiences, emerge under different narratives and in a quite different context. First, in the Italian context, there is basically a civil war in the north of the country. This narrative of competing governments over the same territory is not available in the case of France. Second, institutions do have a different pedigree and legitimacy in the two countries. In particular, in the Italian case, the monarchy and the army are deeply discredited because they were fundamentally supportive of the fascist disaster, of the fascist regime. And in particular, note the fact that the first president of the Council of the Provisional Government, General Badoglio, was actually heavily involved in some of the most hideous colonial experiences of the Italian fascist army. So there is no equivalent, there is no functional equivalent of what, in military terms, de Gaulle represented. There is not, and in my view, under this aspect, Ackermann's book overstate the role of de Gasperi. There is no functional equivalent in charismatic terms of de Gaulle, because de Gasperi is fundamentally a party man, unlike de Gaulle, who can easily sell themselves as the center, the epitome of French resistance. While Italian resistance to the fascist regime is fundamentally a coalition of parties. And that's why organizational charisma there probably is a more adequate concept in order to capture what is going on in the Italian case.
Marco, I'm afraid that we have to.
Yeah, I will wrap it up
quickly.
Yeah, okay, so very quickly, I will just wrap it up and then pose a question. There are phases of, there is clearly a phases of drafting and enactment of the Constituent Assembly. Constitution is enacted in 1948. There are clearly times of crisis of succession and time of consolidation. I will skip those two parts because fundamentally, more or less, they replicate what Ackermann says in the book. But I want to add one quick thing, is that in the phases of consolidation, although the Constitutional Court clearly plays an important role, I want to stress that, again, political parties are the main actors even of the phase of consolidation. When there is an attempt to try to solve crisis of governability by opening up political majority to the former fascists, by using the letter of the Constitution, by resorting to the letter of the Constitution of 1948, what happens is that the political parties, they actually go beyond the letter of the Constitution and they assume again the power to control formation of political majority, and they reject this attempt, making sure that they are the real center of the consolidation of the constitutional order. One last question, which I think is the problematic one at this point. Now, I've been talking about the role of first a certain type of political parties over fundamentally the 20th century. Now, the question is what happens when a constitutional order whose bearers have been organized in a certain way change, I would say drastically, change in terms of their own internal organization, in terms of their own constituency, and even change in terms of their role within or vis-a-vis other institutions. My impression is that this has paved the way, and I identify this as the period after the fall of the wall, for what is not a formal, but definitely a substantial change of political regime. And sorry, I've taken too much time. Thanks. Oh,
sorry for minding the time, but I'm afraid that we have to do that. Now we move from the Italian case to the Portuguese case, which is probably I would dare to say the most intense in terms of how many things and how many changes and shifts happen in a relatively limited period of time. The floor is for Teresa Violante, please.
Thank you, Agustin. I will share my screen. Is it okay now?
Yep.
Okay, so what I will, first of all, thank you for the organizers for having me, and thank you also for Professor Ackermann for giving us the opportunity to discuss with him and collect directly from him feedback on our ideas, on our own drafts and on our own systems. It's really such a great honor. What I will do here very briefly is to present to you the adaptation of Professor Ackermann's four-stage dynamic of the revolutionary pathway to constitutionalism to the Portuguese case. As I was reading the four-stage dynamic, I was thinking, wow, this is really, it seems like it is describing the Portuguese case. It looks like Portugal can be a promising case study to support the four developmental scheme. And I think you can judge for yourselves from what I will present to you right now. So I will briefly expand to you what I think that will fit from time 1 to time 4, since the resistance to dictatorship until today's arrays. So it all begins, of course, with the resistance to dictatorship. The new state of Salazar and the national dictatorship were pretty much, they shared some of the features that Marco Goldoni told us about of the Italian fascist state. It was an anti-parliamentary and illiberal, anti-democratic and corporatist state, authoritarian. There was a single party. There was no partisan competition, no political pluralism. There was a political police, repression of the opposition, torture, censorship, well, all those things that we are familiar with. Until 1943, opposition to the dictatorship was broadly disorganized and weak. It started to become more organized after the Second World War. There was a growing hope that the liberal democracies could pressure the Portuguese dictatorship to democratize. With the beginning of the colonial war in 1961, the opposition to the dictatorship was strengthened because there was strong opposition to this conflict. And with the death of Salazar in 1969 and his succession with his replacement with Marcelo Caetano, there was also the hope that there could be a peaceful transition to democracy. But that those hopes were proven false, and Marcelo Caetano soon showed that there were no real intentions to democratize, and he embarked at the end of his rule on a growing authoritarianism. And the image that we see here is from a concentration camp in Cape Verde that was used by the regime to imprison dissenters, both from mainland Portugal and also from the colonies. The coup d'etat that put an end, that overthrew the dictatorship, took place on 25th of April, 1976. And it inaugurated what Samuel Huntington calls the third wave of democratization, which is the Catholic wave. It was launched by the movement of the armed forces, the MFA. They also enjoyed a vast popular support. It was a successful, non-violent coup that ignited a peaceful uprising and grassroots movements. And the MFA, this military branch, was later institutionalized in a political body called the Council of Revolution in March 1975. And it was eventually entrenched in the Constitution itself in 1976. This body was a non-democratic organ that limited the democratization process. And the entrenchment of the Council of Revolution in the Constitution strengthens the dualistic nature of the original version of the constitutional text. Even after the democratic elections that took place in 1975, 1976, and 1980, the military retained sufficient power, and we can call during this period the Portuguese system a diarchical system of government. The original version of the constitution gave the military veto power over the legislative acts of parliament and government. because instead of creating a constitutional court, which was a solution that was discussed in the Constituent Assembly, it opted to defer the creation of the Constitutional Court to the first revision, and instead decided to assign powers of judicial review to the Council of Revolution, which then became the political guardian of the Constitution. So in 1976, we had the first free elections that were held to choose the members of the Constituent Assembly, and the Democratic parties elected 213 members out of 250. This assembly was given only the mandate to draft a new constitution. During this period, during the whole year 1975, there was a tension between revolutionary legitimacy, which was symbolized by the military. The military was ruling the country. It held the responsibility for governing, for exercising revolutionary and temporary constituent power. And on one side, and on the other side, we had the democratic legitimacy, which was symbolized by the Constituent Assembly, which was responsible for drafting and enacting the new constitutional text. This tension between democratic and revolutionary legitimacy also hid a further tension within the revolutionary process itself. While the moderate members of the military and of the political forces envisaged the revolutionary process as a transitory phenomenon that was aiming at reaching a democratic regime, the more radical and leftist political and military forces framed revolution with the explicit mandate of reaching a socialist and classless society. This was a period of a profound state crisis, and it was sustained by powerful social movements. The main actors during this period were the extreme left parties and the communist parties that were supported by the MFA, that in the meantime took a radical turn to the left. And there were profound tensions that emerged during this period. That were catalyzed also by phenomenon like the agrarian reform, nationalization of large economic groups, urban and rural property occupations, purges in public administrations and private companies. And this period of tension, during this period, the country was on the verge of a civil war between the workers' movement and the Communist Party on one side that demanded a dictatorship of the proletariat and the immediate elimination of the constituents' works. And on the other side, the democratic pluralistic parties and the moderate military members that favored the new constitution and a successful and peaceful transition to a democratic regime. And in the meantime, this period of tension was eased or overcome in 1976 with the constitution that was enacted on the 2nd of April, and then with two democratic elections that were held on the following months. However, this constitution symbolizes the tensions of that period and can be labeled as the undecided constitution, because the great doubt at the time was whether the Portuguese Revolution would lead the country to the Western Bloc of liberal democracies or whether to the Eastern Bloc of the socialist country. And the enactment of the constitution represents the possible synthesis that was possible at the time between antagonistic visions of the world. And the constitutional text itself, on the one side, entrenched the goals of reaching a society without classes, of opening a path towards a socialist society, of socializing wealth and the means of production, and of consecrating the irreversibility nature of all nationalizations conducted after the revolution. But at the same time, it entrenched the principle of political pluralism, fundamental rights, separation of powers, and independence of the judiciary. That's why I call it here the undecided constitution, because it was drawn out of irreconcilable views of the world. And this tension was only eased and softened in 1989 after the second revision to the Constitution. During this period, one feature which is very prominent in Professor Ackerman's construction theory, which is leadership charisma, like in the Italian case, is absent in the Portuguese case. So there is not really a leader, there is no Nero or no de Gaulle in the Portuguese Revolution. What we have here rather is also, like Marco Goldoni told us about in the Italian case, rather a feature of organizational charisma. Portugal provided an extreme example of spontaneous outpouring of egalitarian solidarity and enthusiasm with mass popular mobilizations all throughout this time. And here we can see some of the pictures of those, demonstrations. Then we entered the consolidation period. European membership was a hot topic during those days, not so much during the constituent works, but it was a divisive issue between the two sides of the forces. So while the liberal democratic forces aspired to join the European camp of open democracies, the Marxist factions regarded it as the epitome of capitalism, and some even claimed its incompatibility to occur with the transformative constitutional project. And until 1976, even the European member states were reluctant to invite Portugal to join the club because there was the risk of the country falling into a socialist dictatorship. Adhesion to the European community was thus an important part of the moderation package. The accession request was finally signed on 27 March 1977, and it was very important for the Portuguese elites that regarded the prospect of joining democratic Europe as the possibility of acquiring new rights such as freedom of movement or free movement of capital or protection against confiscation of property. And moreover, the prospect of joining the community would also offer financial incentives, which were very important to build the welfare state, which was very weak as a result of the new state policies. The adaptation to the community system in the Constitution began even before the accession in the first revision of 1982. And this revision also incorporated some deflections from the socialist economic model and extinguished the Council of Revolution, the revolutionary organ, and created the Constitutional Court. In 1989, the second revision to the constitutional text was approved, and by then the economic constitution underwent a profound transformation, and several of the socialist formula were smoothened or even deleted from the text, such as the agrarian reform or the irreversibility of nationalizations and the principle of collective appropriation of the means of production. So by then, in 1989, Portugal had already accessed the European Economic Community, and the socialist dimension of the constitutional text was largely nominal or semantic. And with these profound changes in 1989, the dualistic character of the initial version was finally overcome. So we can talk then of an end to the long constituent process of the Portuguese constitution. But what was left then of the transformative nature of the Portuguese constitution? There was one characteristic that ended up being the most enduring originality of the Portuguese constitution, which is the exhaustive and detailed catalogue of economic and social rights, which is by far the most detailed and precise catalog in the European Union, and if not in the world, one of the most detailed catalog of these rights in a national constitution in the world. And until today, welfare in Portugal equates to April's conquers, so to revolutionary conquers in the political discourse. And moving rapidly to time 3, and for time 3, which in Professor Ackerman's framework is a succession crisis, in the Portuguese case, it is more a time for struggle for memory. So this is a time where there was an institutional and economic convergence with other European member states. But we can find during this period a hot contestation over the new beginning and the foundational myth narratives. On the one hand, the need to make amends with the authoritarian past emerges during this period, and is symbolized in the award of pensions to former members of the political police of the new state. On the other hand, the revolutionary period is growingly demonized for regime blockages in several scenes of the Republic, and colonialism was also a very hot and contested topic. And the constitution is still seen by the conservative parties as taking sides, as being ideologically biased, and as leaning to the left. Despite this narrative, the polarization in the over the constitution did not prevent agreement between the two main political parties to approve several constitutional amendments, and some of them were predetermined by European integration. Moving on to the final stage of our presentation, we move rapidly to time 4, and time 4 is, like in Professor Ackerman's typology, the time for judicial supremacy that eclodes in the aftermath of the financial crisis that followed the Lehman Brothers crash. So when the financial crisis eroded, Portugal was in a very fragile fiscal situation. And as most of you should know, Portugal had to resort to an international financial assistance in the form of a 78 billion loan in February 2011 that subjected the country to a very strict austerity program and to the application of a very strict conditionality program. And most of these austerity measures ended up in the Constitutional Court due to the specific institutional design of judicial review in Portugal, which is very generous and favors constitutional litigation. So between 2010 and 2014, the Constitutional Court became the preferred forum for disputes concerning the austerity measures and conditionality. And then there were several significant strikes to the bailout agreement, and the veto power of the court appeared within a very rich context of social mobilization. These were the years that for the first time since the democratization period, large popular demonstrations were taking place. And the symbology of the revolutionary period was thoroughly revived from social movements to political forces on the left. And this symbology was equated with the constitutional acquis, of which the Constitutional Court stood as the prime guardian. The Constitutional Court's decision's financial impact was enormous and set up a political crisis, not only on the national level, but also at the EU level, as the court's rulings led to several renegotiations of the rescue program. And according to a piece in The Economist that you can read here, European bureaucrats were outraged, saying it's the last socialist constitution in Europe, and the enforcement of the constitution was jeopardizing the austerity strategy designed to cope with the sovereign debt crisis. Through these years, the court gained international recognition by enforcing the symbolic heart of what is left of the revolutionary constitutional acquis against the pressuring demands of the markets, leading the creditors and financial institutions to the brink of a panic attack and risking the integrity of the Eurozone itself. It also produced very significant political consequences because for the first time in the history of Portuguese democracy, it led to the formation of a leftist parliamentary majority. This new political arrangement, and I'm almost finishing, was framed as the arc of the constitution, as opposed to the former arc of government, which was meant as encompassing the two main political parties. This unprecedented level of cooperation between parties on the left that in the past had a history of divergence since the hot years of the revolution created a new governance formula that until today has stood the test of time. And is a symbolic consequence of the constitutional case law on austerity. So the arc of the constitution still remains a powerful rhetorical instrument in political debate. How powerful it will remain in the course of the upcoming devastating crisis produced by the pandemic, well, that is still to be seen. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think now is the turn for our discussant, Massimo Latorre, please.
Agustin, thank you very much. So it's I'm happy and grateful for the invitation to discuss the legitimacy of European constitutional orders, moving from a beautiful book by Professor Bruce Ackerman. Professor Ackerman's work has been a permanent source of inspiration in my research and studies. So I'm very happy to be here with him, I would say, and with you, of course. I'm also especially happy to give a comment following a series of papers that deal with the constitutional development of countries that have been central in the recent history of Europe, among which Italy, my fatherland, in particular. If I can mention a definition of fatherland given by Joseph Roth, wo es mir schlecht geht, dort ist mein Vaterland. So where is, in the place where I suffer, where I do suffer, there is my fatherland. All right, okay. Italy has given us a lot to suffer in the last 20, 30 years, even before, I would say. Anyway, now I would like to start by stressing the vicinity between legal philosophy and legal theory, which are my special field of scholarship, on the one hand, and comparative law on the other. It is well known how much in legal philosophy the search for the concept of law is centered around the controversy between natural law and legal positivism, and how much legal positivism has been the doctrine prevailing in the study of positive law, of legal systems in general. Now, I would like to point out the side effect of comparative law within such core area of the legal philosophical debate. As a matter of fact, legal positivism is challenged by comparative law. An ostensive definition is the paradigmatic way offered by legal positivists to grasp what law is, its nature, if you like. This in front of you, that particular kind of fact, that is the law. This is the usual positivist strategy for definition. An object, an artifact, is showed by pointing with one's finger. You might remember the debate on the concept of law reported by Xenophon in his Memorabilia. It is a short narrative of a discussion between Pericles, the Athenian political leader, and Alcibiades, son of Clinias, Pericles' pupil, a handsome young man, very much admired and indeed loved because of his beauty by many Athenians, among whom we should of course mention Socrates. Now that discussion begins when Alcibiades asks Pericles, what is law? Tell me, Pericles, he said, can you teach me what a law is? Pericles answers that he can and offers a sheer description with reference to the Athenian system of enacting laws. Well, Alcibiades, there is no great difficulty about what you desire. You wish to know what a law is. Laws are all the rules approved and enacted by the majority in assembly, whereby they declare what ought and what not to be done. This is law. This is which you see before you here and now, in this place and at this time. Now, however, comparative law somehow challenges the ostensive definition by its fundamental question, whereby we are addressed in the following way. You say that this fact is law, but what about this other fact, this other system, or this other institution? Is this also law? By comparative law, we are thus pushed to transcend the contingent fact, that specific fact, which for the positivist is the law and all there is in the law. While the positivist says this is the law, the comparativist would then add, but it is moreover this other fact, and this too, and this as well, etc. However, one might also claim that on the contrary, legal positivism is reassured and re-encouraged by comparative law. This is so, one might argue, because comparative law does assume an external, not an internal point of view. It takes as its privileged stance a place outside that specific system without any need to offer or elaborate further a notion of law that could also be operative in that particular system and be able to serve as a reason for action within the system. Comparative law in this way is purely descriptive, neutral, or as the positivist loves to say of his own perspective, morally or normatively inert. For comparative law, it would seem that law and morality are necessarily disconnected. So we might say that comparative law is kind of a compagnon de route of philosophy of law, a fellow traveler. This happens in two main ways. First of all, comparative law confronts us and the lawyer with the other, the different from us, the unexpected. It triggers the wonder, the surprise, which traditionally is the beginning of philosophical enterprise. Here, the secret of the other, or what the other is, in order to be understood, however, should be respected. That is, its specific otherness cannot be cancelled by any possible comparison. Second, comparative law confronts us not only with wonder, but with doubt, too. That is, it confronts us with something, a new fact, a discovery, that opposes the way we conceive and deal with our law. It is based on a gap of a congruent view. This means that a comparative lawyer might play the role of the skeptic in philosophy. There is no philosophy without the opening move of the skeptic thinker, of the one denying that our truth could represent and project itself as a general truth. What is truth? This is Pontius Pilate's unanswered question. Now, what is law? This is the question implicit in any serious comparative law study. However, to reach some cognitive conclusion, we need to go further. To defeat the skeptic challenge, by the way, and be said en passant, this is why a non-cognitivist meta-ethics is a blind ally for moral philosophy. But this is a different story, of course. But if the skeptic challenge, should be overcome, do we also need to go beyond comparative law or not? This is, I believe, a legitimate question within comparative law itself. Moreover, we might say that comparative law is a declination of the history of law. This was a point stressed by Guido Fassò, a distinguished Italian legal philosopher teaching in Bologna in the 60s and 70s of last century. You cannot really compare without having first a good look at the history of what you are going to compare. Law to be compared cannot consist just of texts or be considered an essence. Indeed, what has a history can be treated only as having an existence, not really an essence. But how could we compare? And why should we compare? Las comparaciones son odiosas. Comparisons are detestable, as the Spanish saying goes. If we want to compare, don't we need a tertium comparationis? And this would be equivalent, so to say, to a third fact of law that we could use as a standard and a model, but where to find it? Should it be grasped through a view from nowhere? How could we be able to compare different specific histories? Well, we could easily compare specific histories if we would take out of them their cultural sting, so to say, their communitarian color. This is a strategy that is always available, though somewhat dangerous. Sometimes it might seem that comparative law studies are sort of a Eurovision festival, where the different countries' songs are fungible, interchangeable. In the same vein, from a comparative vantage point, the landscape becomes or can become culturally flat or colorless. Constitutionalism would thus be a world where there is no possible incommensurability of rules and values. This, by the way, could be seen as a propedeutic move towards global constitutionalism. This indeed has two dimensions, global constitutionalism, two dimensions, a vertical and a horizontal one. Vertical global constitutionalism is the idea of an emerging global constitutional order. This emergence, this new birth, however, might need horizontal constitutionalism. That is a collection of working legal orders that we could ascribe to constitutionalism as a system with a constitution serving as a rule limiting sovereignty and top decision making, and with identical traits and times. In short, to conceive a global constitutionalism, we should perhaps reshape the polarity between constitutional orders and culture to make them congruent with each other, or at least mutually compatible. Another solution would be to lay down, as tertium comparationis, a history of histories. That is, at the end of the day, a philosophy of history. Now, this is a risk that Professor Ackerman might think worth taking in his so interesting and rich new book. We find in the book an atemporal categorical perspective proposed, three sorts of constitutions, revolutionary, elitist, establishmentarian, all of them in the framework of a general notion, a philosophy of constitutionalism. This is quite generous, somehow too generous, as it has been hinted by Professor Lacklin in his paper. It is meant as an institutional scheme for binding government, top decision makers, though it is clearly distinguished from a mere rule of law that could be still compatible with an authoritarian state. Furthermore, we are proposed an evolutionary movement internal to the evolutionary ideal type of constitution. As for this specific revolutionary form of constitutionalism, this, we are told, has progressed following 4 stages, 4 points in time of an internal evolution. We have first a revolution with a human face on a human scale, then a constitution steered by charismatic leadership, later a time of resistance and disappointment, finally consolidation, which mostly happens through the providential rise of judicial review and the court of constitutional judges. Now, revolutionary constitutions are presented by Professor Ackerman as rooted in a revolution at a human scale. But what is a revolution at a human scale? In the Italian resistance against fascism, is the Italian resistance against fascism comparable to the Polish Solidarność movement? Is the collapse of the Soviet Union comparable to the defeat of Nazi Germany? Is Wałęsa the Polish De Gasperi and De Gasperi the Italian Wałęsa? And why should the revolutionary constitution be related to and justified through a charismatic leadership? In the Italian resistance movement, De Gasperi was not seen as endowed with a special charisma, nor, I would say, any other political leader, with the exception perhaps of the communist Togliatti, whose attempt of assassination in 1948 was triggering a general working class insurrection in northern Italy. What does a disappointment or a standstill in the Italian Republican constitutional story really mean? Were the social and political tensions in the 70s, strategia della tensione and anni di piombo, a time of consolidation? And why should we expect the consolidation of a revolutionary constitution from the most conservative among political actors, that is, judges, moreover, constitutional judges, that can actively impinge upon the ordinary play of popular sovereignty? Should we forget that the Italian state was, at least till the beginning of the 90s, something of a double state? A constitutional state under the umbrella of the Republican Constitution on the one hand, and a deep state acting outside the constitutional legality with Gladio and other secret Cold War organization monitoring every step of the Republican political life on the other hand. Of this double state, by the way, we still know very little. Indeed, a double reading of the recent Italian constitution is possible and plausible. We might interpret it, on the one hand, as a consolidation of the constitutional order established in the aftermath of the struggle against fascism. On the other hand, we could read it as a reassessment and rearrangement of a material constitution whose actors were meant to be political actors. Once these actors have withered away. What about the collapse of the party system in Italy?
Massimo, 2 minutes.
Yes, but I'm Leon. Well, 2 minutes.
We only have 2 minutes.
Oh my God. Agustin, you are cutting my head in this way. You are beheading me.
I have to be without pity.
Well, I don't know what I can. Well, I stop because I cannot do. I'm sorry. I cannot develop the. I cannot develop the argument. I stop here. I think I already advanced some comments and some views and doubts. I think this is all right, like this.
But perhaps if you want to address the 2 papers.
Well, the 2 papers, I can only say that I fundamentally agree. I found the 2 papers extremely interesting and think I don't have any special criticism or objection. I would stress, I would have stressed more specifically the Italian way to social state, which was a very special one. And I think this is needs to be studied. And I think this, it was fundamentally the system of the partecipazioni statali, a very strong statist interventionism in the production, not only just in the redistribution of, it was not a matter of social rights or social benefits. It was really the idea that political power had to be in control of the market, at least as much as possible. So this was the idea. And I think this should be addressed also because this is gone. And so we are in a completely different economic constitution now in Italy, which is completely opposed to the original wording and also spirit of the 1948 constitution. So this is a real tragedy in our Italian, in our system. We are far away from the economic constitution, which was envisaged and actually implemented for 20 years in the country. And for the, as far the Portuguese case is concerned, I would stress the point we discussed this morning, and I think this is worth stressing, that the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court in Portugal, though it has been very brave to oppose the austerity policy, has taken, so to say, kind of Austrian path in its judicial review, let's say, methodology, if you like, deferring back to the parliament sovereignty. So in this sense, it is very interesting, the strategy taken and used by the Portuguese court, which is not the German one, which is not either the Italian one. It is more Kelsenian, it is rather Austrian. So it is a Supreme Court that nonetheless leaves open the way for a strong, notion of parliamentary supremacy, which is still there, and which is not actually tamed, so to say, tamed or strongly supervised by the Constitutional Court. In this sense, perhaps, there is much more consolidation of the Constitution in Portugal than there has been in Italy. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. And now we wait for the questions coming from the audience.
Don't I get a chance to speak?
But wait, I think we will try to collect questions coming from everybody. Are there questions? I think this was the rules of engagement that we agreed. That you have the chance to speak.
I understand that, but that's all right.
Are there questions coming from the audience?
Hi, Augustine, I'm Renata. I'm not sure if you see the raised hand bit.
Yeah?
I'm sorry. We ask you please to turn your video off and just write your question in the chat. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think while we wait for the questions to be posed from the audience, Professor Ackerman, you wanted to pose a question?
Sure. I just want to respond. First to Massimo. You say a lot, but let me just say in what my fundamental approach is. The foundation is Dilthey. Wie es eigentlich gewesen war. It is not that I am an outsider making a distinction between law and morality. Rather, the aim is to understand how the actors themselves understood the problem of legitimacy. And it is this a crucial point, which is at the foundation of the enterprise. So the question is, and this is, I thought, really the fundamental contribution of both papers here, was to say, aha, the way the actors understood the processes of constitutional legitimation in the post-war period, in both Portugal and in Italy, was through organizational charisma. It is not the case that any peerless leader emerges. Moreover, one should emphasize that de Gaulle is repudiated in 1946. He is not the peerless leader. Rather, what we see in France and in Italy and later on in Portugal is precisely the three movement parties or more movement parties, which then the challenge is to coordinate and express in a self-conscious way the foundations upon which they can agree while disagreeing on all of many other things. And it is precisely the constitutionalization of different movement parties, which is the characterization of each of these examples. So that is the fundamental point that I understand both of these papers to be making, and it is analytically very different from the legal positivist law and morality distinction. Rather, we have to understand how the participants themselves, and one crucial point is they repudiate the prior regime. Now, the prior regime, Salazar's regime, is distinctively different from Mussolini's regime, and so forth. And therefore, the mode of repudiation, the principles of repudiation are importantly different. But we can compare them precisely because of this Dilthey method of not looking backward and saying, oh, he won, you lost. No, rather to understand how the problems of legitimation are confronted at the very time at which they are confronted. And that is similar to today. We have to understand the problems of legitimation in precisely the ways they are being confronted. And the one wonderful example about Portugal from this respect is that it is a classic example of federalism. What do we have here? In a federal system composed of 27 member states, it is only to be expected that different regions express different political views as the majority ascendant view. Here we have in Portugal a country that is committed to social, that's to some fundamental economic rights of individuals of a foundational kind, economic rights. Then we have in Hungary a country that is not so much committed to enlightened principles of fundamental rights, but rather is coming out of the tradition of Herder, cultural nationalism, rather than Enlightenment nation state. How does the Enlightenment principles of the European Union, which are less than economically egalitarian, Portugal, but Enlightenment fundamental principles of human rights, Hungary, how does the center engage with these local majorities? With difficulty. This kind of tension between the center and different states is constitutive of a federal system. When we go back to the Holy Roman Empire, we will see the same tensions. When we go to the United States, forget about right now, we will see the same tensions between particular states. Let's take California. California right now is basically refusing to implement rules that would require the deportation of non-legal residents. Just refusing. The center is in tension here. How is this going to be reconciled? With difficulty. But it isn't as if this never happens. This is constitutive of a federal system. Similarly, so this thought that the European Union, it doesn't display this absolutely standard characteristics of a federal system is only blinding us to wie es gewesen war. I understand, of course, and so this it isn't the other fundamental suggestion I want to propose in response to this fascinating paper on Portugal is that it is a special case of, if I had to develop, and I will be developing, a fourth ideal type of where the military takes the lead in a revolutionary transformation. The Portuguese case is to be understood as a case whose paradigmatic example in modern history is Ataturk. What is Ataturk? Ataturk repudiates this great imperial tradition by having a secularized super Frenchman. Yes, this secularized army. Every male who is illiterate is drafted into the army and is educated into the secular principles of the French Republic. The school system is universal, and you can't get out, even though you are for the first few years of your life in as you were in a rural area, pervasively ignorant. Then and what Ataturk then does in this extraordinary, this is the most radical French move in world history, much more radical than anything that Lenin tries to do, and that is he makes it impossible for everyone to be able to read the script of the Turkish Empire. And the script is, of course, Roman French letters. So that this great tradition is repudiated to the point where it is illegible. Now, what Erdogan is doing is, so the crucial thing in 2014 was that he has finally destroyed the position of the military as the guardian of the secular republic. And he is now, for the first time, having an educational system in which people are beginning to learn for the first time in a century the old script. So they can recapture.
Bruce, I'm afraid
yes,
we have.
But I understand. But all that I'm saying is that the crucial point is to understand that this notion of military revolutionary leadership is not exemplified by de Gaulle in 1946. He's repudiated, and the three parties are the constructors of the republic that has the most rapid growth rate, more rapid than Germany. And that the Portuguese case is to be understood precisely through the methods of Dilthey as more similar to the case of Turkey, which permitted Turkey to get into NATO. Thank you.
Okay, I think there was some confusion on the use of the video but I am told now that questions can be asked also through the video in the case of Joanna Mendes and Renata Witz. So please, Joanna.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah. So I already wrote my question in the chat for Teresa. Teresa, thank you very much for your talk. And I particularly liked, well, among other aspects, the epithet of the undecided constitution. But I wanted to stress the last period, since 2010, and the role of the, well, less the role of the Constitutional Court, then the social element, or you've emphasized what is left of the transformative nature of the Portuguese Constitution is largely the catalogue of social and economic rights, which upholds still in the Constitution the model of the social state. And I wanted to ask you, much of the structures of the welfare state that had been put in place have been largely depleted with the austerity measures. But my sense is that this was less an imposition from abroad, although of course we were under a memorandum of understanding, obviously, than an opportunity that internal political forces in government at the time, with support, electoral support, used to push through a political agenda that I would have otherwise not been able to push through. So I'm not sure if you agree with this view or not, and I would like to hear your opinion on that. Sorry for the background noise. And also your view on the extent to which an issue that I think is particularly important in what might or will very likely come, the extent to which the transformations that have occurred in Portugal under the Memorandum of Understanding, the extent to which they have disrupted the balance between the liberal and the social dimension of the Constitution in the post-1918 settlement. Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for your talk. Thank you also, Marco and Massimo, for the very interesting thoughts.
Yeah, I think Teresa.
Thank you, Joanna, for your questions. Thank you also to Professor Ackerman for his comments, and to Professor Latorre. Going straight to Joanna's questions, yes, I think that the domestic politicians also saw the Memorandum of Understanding as an opportunity to implement some of the policies that they actually wanted to implement. Some of them were also part of a package of constitutional reform that they tried to introduce 1 year before. So there was a convergence of wills, so to speak, between the European and international financial institutions and the national actors that were then in power. I don't think that really changes the scenario for the purposes of our analysis. As to what regards the changes that the Memorandum of Understanding has introduced in our Constitution, I don't think it was really the MOU or the bailouts that introduced those changes. It was really the impact on the national Constitution that came from European integration. So the impact produced on the national Constitution and the decoupling of the political and economic Constitution. So we have at the domestic level, as Professor Ackerman was saying, a Constitution which is deeply committed to social rights and to imposing on the state several obligations to mounting and supporting a national health system and a national system for education and a national security system. But then we have a constitution at the fiscal level that has to abide with monetary restrictions and fiscal restrictions and all the package that comes from economic and monetary integration. So we have these two dimensions that are clashing. and they had been clashing for quite some time now, but we only realized that that tension when the austerity came about and when the financial crisis ecloded. So I mean, this is a problem that the Constitutional Court faced during this stage, and it decided to ignore that there was an international dimension to it, and it simply it played it as a purely national conflicts. They were not purely national, and sooner or later also the European Court of Justice will have to face this kind of conflicts as European conflicts that they are. They are federal conflicts, as Professor Ackerman has mentioned. Should I answer also the other questions, Agustin, that are in the chat?
If you wish, so.
Okay.
But Renata, I think, will ask the question herself, I think. The question is, if I may say so, coming from what Joanna was pointing, at some point in the paper, you refer back to the debate in the 70s on European integration. But this tension between free movement of capital, especially capital to third countries, and any attempt at building up a socio-economic constitution does not, at the end of the day, mean that they were not completely wrong, the Eurosceptics. That there is a tension between a socio-economic constitution, a social democratic state, and the present so-called material constitution of the European Union.
Yes, they were not completely wrong, and the Eurosceptics and some of them are still living. We are one of the European countries with still an ongoing Communist Party, and the Communist Party has remained to these days opposed to European integration. And when the financial crisis came along, they were saying, see, we were right. All that we said that was going to happen really happened. So at the end of the day, it was not so evident in those heydays after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and during those days where I mentioned that there was a struggle for memory, and there was, you know, those crazy days of the end of history where there was, it seemed more clear that the liberal democracy was winning, but it became more evident after the financial crisis that this is a conflict that you cannot shove under the carpet.
Thanks a lot. Renata.
Thank you very much, Agustin. Wonderful papers. I enjoyed them both. To Teresa, actually, to follow up to what Joanna was asking, and I'm also, I think it's a riff on what Professor Tognati put in the chat, which is so you emphasize the tensions between the liberal and the social state, but in the paper you also say that there is mobilization of symbols from the military coup, and somehow this way of formulating dissent appears also to have some spot or site in the constitutional acquis. You say this on page 11, maybe, and I'm just wondering, where does the military fit and with all its symbolism fit in this tension which you outlined, and fit in the acquis more broadly? And my question to Marco, which I also, it's just what I typed up. So you play in the paper with the party versus movement dynamic. And I know it's a big jump in time, but how does this fit with the appeal of technocratic leaders who are not associated with either movement or party? And if you could add the European dimension to that as well, it would be really, at least for me, it would complete the picture. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So I think Teresa first, and then Marco.
Okay, thank you. The military, in the meantime, the process with the military, although it was not easy to see during those hot days, but it was peacefully solved. So the Council of Revolution was extinguished in 1982, and the military ceased having a formal political role, and its tasks were spread between the Constitutional Court, the President of the Republic, and the Parliament. And for this process to take place in such a smooth way, the role of some people in some fundamental places was very important. So when I speak about the symbology of the revolutionary period in that part of the paper that you, Renata, mentioned, it's not so much of the symbology of the military themselves, but other types of symbology, such as songs and the flowers and the mottos that they used during those types and those Marxist logos. So not so much the military symbology. Going very quickly to Augustine's questions. To Augustine's question, I do think that the military role during that period, especially the coups the attempted coups that you mentioned, can amount to a form of organizational charisma. And indeed, I didn't have the opportunity to mention, but the military also played a role in the constitutional text itself. So the constitutional text is not only the product of the Constituent Assembly, but also the product of two documents that were signed between the MFA, the military movement, and the political parties. So they also had a formal role in the constituent process itself. So after the post-November 1976, there was a strengthening of the democratic legitimacy role and a weakening of the revolutionary legitimacy, so to speak. So yes, there is here, as you mentioned, a routinization of the charisma. I think I've also answered Professor Toniati's question as to the transfer of power from the militaries to the civilians. It was very important in this role, in this transfer, the role of some moderate members of the military. I think I've answered everyone's questions.
Okay, Marco.
So the question of the rise of technocrats and in general of the impact of European integration is absolutely relevant for, I would say in general, for how we thematize constitutional change today. So the fact that in the last 30 years, we have seen in Italy at least 3 governments of so-called national unity headed by either central bankers or university professors. And note the difference here. The military doesn't seem to be a provider of political personalities, but note the fact that central bankers have become actually extremely important. So first Ciampi from the Bank of Italy, and then Draghi, both Treasury and then Bank of Italy and then European Central Bank, are actually at the head of a government which is de facto a government of national unity. But at the same time, I don't think it is these experiences are totally comparable or functional equivalent, to be more specific, to previous experiences of governments of national unity. I mean, the government of national unity between 76, 78, in order to counter the terrorist threat, was of a different nature and quality because of the types of political parties that were behind it. And this is, I think, is the most substantial change between one regime and the other, if there has been a change. And until Ciampi, I mean, there was not basically the possibility, for a what we would call today a technocrat to become the president of the council. Now, all of this is obviously also, in all of this is also very important, the European integration. Now, we have 2 different views on this in constitutional doctrine, whether it has always been impactful in terms of domestic constitutional dynamics, or whether the Maastricht Treaty generates a change. I mean, my impression is that for a number of reasons, the Maastricht Treaty is really a turning point. And from that on, there is a certain type of reorganization of both the political system and the certain type of elite that somehow instrumentalize European integration in order to realize changes that are materially not constitutional changes. And under this aspect, probably, I would say that the space has been opened up by the fact that you do have now cartel parties or catch-all parties, and you don't have any more parties with a clear, or I mean, with a few exceptions, obviously, with a clear constituency. When I mean with a clear constituency, I mean with homogeneous or relatively homogeneous spheres of interest to be protected and to be promoted. And under this aspect, this means that you have all the, I would say, forces, most likely in the European case, economic forces and financial forces in particular, I would say, that are capable of mobilizing both the symbolic and the material level in order to rearrange parts of the constitutional order. So yeah, I don't know, but I'm still undecided. I think this is a general question of how we think today of the quality of constitution making. I mean, because until, I would say, a few decades ago, democratic constitution making would be equivalent to an expansive mode, further integration or inclusion of rights or new subjects. At a certain point, in certain European constitutional experiences, and Italy is one of them, these are stopped. These are stopped. Either formal or informal constitution making is not anymore equivalent to constitutional expansion of either rights or powers. It seems actually to be, if I may call it like this, a deconstitutional moment under one aspect, I would say.
Yeah, I think Marco Dani wanted to intervene.
Thank you, Agustin. I have two short questions, one for Marco and one for Teresa. The first for Marco. You have mentioned that the Maastricht Treaty now can be regarded as a turning point in the evolution of the Italian constitutional system and a watershed in a change of regimes. One could counteract to this argument, which, by the way, I share, with a different argument, basically saying that until Maastricht, there was a certain rendering of the Italian democratic constitution, but what has changed has been the interpretation of that constitution, which is an open constitution and which lends itself to a variety of different material orders. I would be curious to know how you would react to this kind of objection. To Teresa instead, I really enjoyed the paper. There is only a point on which we probably disagree, and I would like to hear your reaction on this. It has to do with the consolidation phase and with the role of the Constitutional Tribunal vis-à-vis the Memorandum of Understanding. In your paper, and also in the presentation, you said that the Constitutional Tribunal has operated as a veto power, and although in the paper you said, but it didn't hinder the adjustment program. Yet again, in the paper you say that judicial contestation of austerity was a successful strategy. As far as I understand, your argument is basically that this constitutes time 4 of Ackermann chronology, and we can look at the Constitutional Tribunal as an opponent, as really doing its job to defend the constitutional identity of Portugal, and so the social democratic pact underlying it. But here is my objection. I'm not sure that those judgments, for all the resonance they got, are judgments that are really resisting the austerity measures. As you also said, they didn't hinder the adjustment program. They encouraged, they triggered some recalibration of the Memorandum of Understanding, but ultimately austerity was not reversed. What probably those judgments have done, they have basically encouraged an austerity with a human face. they made austerity sustainable to some extent. But if that is true, isn't this not consolidation, but precisely the opposite, betrayal, because they are enabling a type of neoliberal strategy that undermines from the real basis of the social democratic constitution. So we have a constitutional court which is doing precisely the opposite of resistance. An Italian scholar who, at least yesterday, was in connection with us, I don't know if he's here today, is Sergio Bartole, once wrote that the moment in which the Italian constitution opened itself unconditionally to European integration, so without defending a constitutional identity, that would mean the suicide of the constitution. So I'm wondering here if in the Portuguese case, we are witnessing a case of assisted suicide of the constitution, with the Constitutional Tribunal assisting the suicide of the social democratic constitution. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think it's we still have time for the reply of Marco and Teresa, please.
Try to be super quick. So the open constitution, I mean, it's a matter of degree, probably. Obviously, not all options were available even before Maastricht. And actually, there were certain strong constraints. I mean, Massimo Latore has indicated an important one. When you have an industrial state, a state that is actively involved in the economy, then the constitutional order can take up certain shapes and certain forms, but not others. No? I mean, there's a strict link between the organization of the political economy, the political system, and the structure of the constitutional order. So my feeling is that those who think that there have always been the possibility of accommodating different, I would say, let's call it political economies within the Italian constitution. They are wrong. They are clearly wrong. You cannot accommodate anything. I mean, and actually, to a certain extent, the constitutional order is always somehow sitting within the coupling between the political and the economic system. I mean, it's unavoidable. And that's how then it is reflected in the organization of the constitution. I don't know whether this addresses your concerns, Marco.
Teresa?
Thank you. What I mean when I wrote that it was a successful strategy was in the sense that it proved wrong the narrative of no alternative, which was an hegemonic alternative. So the bailout conditions were presented as being the only way possible out of that difficult situation. And in that regard, the Constitutional Court proved the political branches and the financial institutions wrong because it forced them to search for alternatives. But to want a domestic court, especially a domestic court from a periphery country to challenge the whole austerity framework, I think it's wanted to want too much, especially when we're discussing cases that adjudicate measures on a singular situation. I mean, that would just simply would not be possible. That is simply something that you cannot ask from a court. So in that regard, I don't think it's an unfair, it is not a fair criticism to be made to a court, the criticism that the Constitutional Court helped in assisting the suicide of the social democratic constitution, the Portuguese social democratic constitution. On the other hand, I think it helped to revive the constitution, especially on the symbolic level, and which is very important. It produced this very important symbolic effects of producing a whole new political alignment of parties on the left, parties that had never been in a coalition at all in democratic times, because they had this history since revolutionary times, that you had this sanitary fence that you wouldn't pass to the other side, because on the other side there were the communists and the Marxist factions, and you wouldn't pass that sanitary fence. And that symbolic fence has been overcome because, I mean, not only, but on the basis of the change of structure that the case law of the court has allowed, and I think that is very powerful to be produced as a result of a court's action.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think it is 6 o'clock and we have to wrap up. We started with the trajectories of 2 constitutions that we label as revolutionary. As we have looked more carefully into them, we start seeing that perhaps trajectories have shifted, and we will need to add complexity to the picture. Tomorrow we have the 3rd session that moves us north towards the United Kingdom and the Scandinavian countries. Of course, everybody is more than welcome to come back tomorrow for another 2 hours of discussion. Thanks a lot.